Hey, welcome back to part 13 of Peter Walker's From Surviving to Thriving. Before we start the reading, we're picking up in chapter 4 with the subtitle Surviving versus Thriving. But before I do that, I just wanted to share this. It's a quote by Carl Jung, and I think it's really powerful when it comes to this type of work. Well, when it comes to living a fulfilled and happy life. To be aware until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And then there's, of course, the ancient know thyself first. That also applies. Now let's see. Chapter 4, Subsection Surviving versus Thriving. Recovery involves learning to handle unpredictable shifts in our inner emotional weather. Perhaps the ultimate dimension of this is what I call the surviving-thriving continuum. Before we enter into recovery, it may feel like life is nothing but a struggle to survive. However, when recovery progresses enough, we begin to have some experiences of feeling like we are thriving. These may start out as feelings of optimism, hopefulness, and certainty that we are indeed recovering. And then the bottom inevitably drops out because recovery is never all forward progress. Oh, so unfairly, we are back to feeling that we can barely survive. To make matters worse, we are amnesiac that we ever even had a respite from surviving. Another flashback has hit, and we polarize back into the surviving end of the continuum. We are stuck in the anxious and dreaded feelings of the abandonment melange. In survival mode, even the most trivial and normally easy task can feel excruciatingly difficult. As in childhood, it all just feels too hard. And if the flashback is especially intense, the thanatos, I've never seen that word before, thanatos, the thanatos may start knocking down the door. The thanatos is the death urge described by Freud, and in a flashback, it corresponds with the suicidal ideation we looked at in chapter 1. Wow, the thanatos is the death urge described by Freud. Once again, it is important to repeat that this feeling state is a flashback to the worst times in childhood, when our will to live was so compromised. As mindfulness improves, we can recognize suicidal ideation as evidence of a flashback and begin to rescue ourselves with the Chapter 8 flashback management steps, which we talked about in Chapter 1 actually as well. As recovery progresses, polarization back into survival mode do not take us to the utter despair end of the continuum so often. Nonetheless, survival mode can still feel pretty awful, especially when it is characterized by high anxiety or immobilizing depression. Being in survival is especially difficult during those times when flashback management is less effective, and feelings that life is a struggle can hang on for days and even weeks. This is the territory where flashbacks morph into extended regressions. I believe regressions are sometimes a call from our psyche to address important developmental arrests. In this case, it is the need to learn unrelenting self-acceptance during a period of extended difficulty. It is also the need to develop a staunch and unyielding sense of self-protection. This fundamental instinct of fiery willingness to defend ourselves from unfairness needs to strengthen progressively so that we can withstand inner critic attacks. Moreover, we can grow in our ability to survival by using the Chapter 13 mindfulness techniques to practice and build enduring self-compassion. Moreover, if we are far enough along in recovery to have a safe ally, we can enlist their support to help us verbally ventilate out our pain at being stuck in survival. Temptations can be great at such times to revert to the less functional ways of self-soothing that we learned when we were younger. Depending on your 4F type, this commonly manifests as increased eating, substance abuse, working, sleeping, and or sexually acting out. Sometimes we are triggered into self-medicating in this way because we are desperately trying to keep ourselves on the thriving end of the continuum. Desperately clinging to thriving is a hard impulse to resist, even when we are in reality way past its expiration date. Yet, as recovery and mindfulness increases, we begin to notice that this type of self-medicating indicates that we are in a survival flashback. We are no longer authentically on the thriving end of the continuum. We have compounded our regression by regressing further, by self-medicating to unnaturally prolong a preferred existence. At such times, we benefit most by reinvoking our intention to practice self-acceptance, by recommitting to being there for ourselves, no matter where we are on the continuum. As bears repeating, all human beings are existentially challenged to handle disappointing shifts out of thriving and into surviving. We survivors, however, have greater difficulties handling these transitions because we were abandoned for so long at the surviving end of the continuum. Yet, as our recovery progresses, we can learn to become increasingly self-supportive in times of being stuck in survival. Difficulties in identifying the signs of recovery. Some readers may work on their recovery for a long time, and erroneously and shamefully feel they are not making any progress because of the all or none thinking that typically accompanies complex PTSD. Survivors in the early stages of recovery often fail to notice or validate their own actual progress. If we do not notice the degrees of our own improvement in our recovery work, we are in great danger of giving up on recovering. Because of black and white thinking, we can regularly fall into the trap of not acknowledging and valuing what we are actually accomplishing. Perfectionistic dismissal of improvement that is not 100% is common in early recovery. Here are some common areas where I see that recovering survivors fail to notice and self-validate their progressive degrees of improvement. Number 1, less intense launching into a 4F response. 2, increasing resistance to the critic. 3, increased mindfulness about flashbacks or inner critic attacks. 4, increased time feeling good enough about yourself. 5, progress in meeting arrested developments listed in Chapter 2. 6, decreased overeating or use of self-medicating substances. 7, increased experiences of good enough relating with others. 8, decreased in the painfulness and intensity of flashback feelings. In terms of number 3 above, It is important to note that even when mindfulness does not immediately terminate a flashback or a critic attack, noticing and identifying these complex PTSD phenomena is more progressive than just being blindly lost in them. Moreover, ongoing recognition makes effective, this word means tending to improve, ameliorative. Wow, never seen that word either. Ameliorative. Ameliorative action, or like I said before, tending to improve action more accessible. It makes us increasingly likely to remember to use the flashback management steps listed in chapter 8, which we worked on in chapter 1. Furthermore, it is important that we notice the gradually decreasing intensity of the flashback feeling of anxiety, shame, and depression. In this regard, social anxiety can gradually reduce along a continuum that stretches from panicky withdrawal to a more tolerable social discomfort, to periods of social ease. Additionally, depression can gradually diminish along a continuum that stretches from paralyzing despair to anhedonia, which is lack of ability to feel pleasure. Sucks. And an inability to enjoy normal life pleasures, to a state of tired and relatively unmotivated peacefulness. Of course, both these processes typically improve at a vacillating back and forth rate. As I write this, I feel some old sadness about the many decades that I judged my emotional tone and mood as either good or bad in a very all or nothing way. If I was not feeling very good, then I felt as if everything was really bad. And since feeling very good is something most human beings only get to experience a relatively small portion of the time, my perception of feeling bad became a much more dominant experience than was necessary. In fact, mildly unpleasant feelings typically morphed me quickly into feeling terrible via shame-tinged all or nothing thinking. I am so grateful for the life-changing epiphany that led me to trade in my old primary aspirations of celebration for my new use of serenity. To be calm and at peace. How does it get any better than that? Inner critic thought processes refute signs of progress whenever a new flashback occurs, no matter how much less intense it is than before. Every reoccurrence of feeling shame, fear, or depression is interpreted as proof that nothing has changed. Wow. Even when there are increasing periods of not being triggered. The critic's black and white assessment is, quote, either I'm cured or I'm still hopelessly defective, end quote. And once you identify with your critic's pronouncements of defectiveness, you are off and spiraling downward into a full-fledged flashback, captured once again in the ice veneer of toxic shame that freezes one in the complex PTSD stranglehold of helplessness and hopelessness. If you're experiencing that, know that it can get better. If I did it, I'm positive you can too. Accepting recovery as a lifelong progress. It is exceedingly difficult to accept the proposition, the fact, that recovery is never complete. And although we can expect our flashbacks to markedly decrease over time, it is tremendously difficult and sometimes impossible to let go of the salvation fantasy that we will one day be forever free of them. Yes, it is very hard to get rid of that salvation fantasy. Yet, when we do not loosen our grip on the salvation fantasy, we remain extremely susceptible to blaming ourselves every time we have a flashback. Understanding this is so crucial because recovery typically progresses in a process that has many temporary regressions. Moreover, most recoveries often have the unfortunate subjective experience that the temporary regression feels as permanent as concrete. This is especially true because of the interminability feeling of flashbacks. And I'm sure I've said this before, but it was about 3 years ago, after I'd already left California and was in 3 Points, Arizona, kicking it in a tent, totally working on gardening and vibing with myself and getting to know myself. I got depressed so quickly in 2 weeks that by the end of those 2 weeks, I was starting to feel suicidal, and it shocked me. It wrecked my peace. I couldn't believe I was back to giving up. And I ended up using $50 worth of mushrooms, the magic kind. And I set my intentions the night before, and I did the ceremony, and it got me out of it. And I honestly still don't understand, and I guess this is what they're talking about, the salvation fantasy, how I could have gone back to that. And so fast. So yeah, don't think it can't happen. When we flash back, we regress to our child mind. The child mind, which was incapable of imagining a future any different than the everlasting present of being so abandoned. So how can we come to bear the knowledge that our awful childhoods have created some permanent damage? It helps me to see my complex PTSD as somewhat analogous or similar in some way to diabetes, i.e., a condition that will need management throughout my life. This is a piece of bad news that naturally feels offensively unpalatable, but the good news, as with diabetes, is that we become more skilled at flashback management. Complex PTSD can gradually become infrequently bothersome, and even more importantly, we can evolve towards leading increasingly rich and rewarding lives. Facts. Even better news is that complex PTSD, when efficiently managed, eventually bestows gifts. Yes. It comes with significant silver linings, unavailable to those less traumatized, as we will see at the end of the chapter. Therapeutic flashbacks and growing pains. Healing from childhood trauma is also a long, gradual process because recovering your full self-expression requires a great deal of practice. Being yourself can be intimidating and flashback-inducing. Healthy self-assertion was punished like a capital crime in many dysfunctional families. Expressing yourself in ways that your parents forbade typically triggers intense flashbacks at first. This can cause you to lose sight of how this practice gradually reduces the chronic pain of remaining invisible. We can encourage ourselves to face these growing pains by conceptualizing them as therapeutic flashbacks. Therapeutic flashbacks. Go back into that scene and parent yourself into better states of mind, and that will lead to better emotional states, or vice versa. And redo the scene. Make that memory new. Protect yourself and have self-compassion for yourself. When you're stuck in that flashback, rework it. It's hard, but it's possible. Reclaim the fundamental human right that our parents denied us, and to finally own what is rightfully ours for the taking, our authentic selves. We can further bolster ourselves for such necessary flashbacks by comparing speaking up to going to the dentist for a toothache. Unless we accept the acute pain of the dentist's therapeutic procedure, we will suffer chronic dental discomfort indefinitely. Unless we speak up, the loneliness of our silence will imprison us forever. Powerful. Recovering from overwhelmingly painful childhood is also so difficult because we understandably want to avoid any further pain at all. That's why a lot of people just say, fuck it, don't think about it. Just don't think about it. To be aware until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life. And you will call it fate. Thank you, Mr. Carl Jung. However, if we are to ever recover our real voice, we must sometimes invoke the energy of bravery. Bravery is, in my opinion, defined by fear. It is taking right action despite being afraid. It is not brave to do things that are not scary. The anger work described in Chapter 11 can help you with this enormously. With a strong enough intention, you can begin by occasionally invoking the kind of courage that involves feeling the fear and doing it anyway. You can nudge yourself to do it to rescue your inner child from loneliness of never being seen or heard. Moreover, when we embrace this practice, we will eventually learn that fear does not have to be disabling. We can be afraid and still act powerfully. We can refuse to tolerate never speaking up, never having our say, never stating a preference, and never saying no to set a boundary. With enough practice, therapeutic flashbacks not only diminish, but begin to be replaced by a healthy sense of pride in ourselves for our courageous self-championing. More and more, we are rewarded with feelings of safe belonging in the world. The world gets pretty exciting after that. It is crucial for deeper level recovery that we learn that feelings of fear, shame, and guilt are sometimes signs that we have said or done the right thing. There are emotional flashbacks to how we were traumatized for trying to claim normal human privileges. As our recovery progresses, we need to learn to endure these feelings. Reinterpreting the deeper meaning of these feelings is key to accomplishing this. Typically, this involves epiphanies like the following. Quote, I feel afraid now, but I am not in danger like I was as a child. I feel guilty not because I am guilty, but because I was intimidated into feeling guilty for expressing my opinions, my needs, or my preferences. I feel shame because my parents rained disgust on me for being me. I say no to these toxic parental curses, and they are curses. And I am proud and right to see how they tried to murder my soul. And I am proud and right to see how they tried to murder my soul. Wow, that's a hell of a sentence. I give them their shame back in disgust. The disgust any healthy adult feels when he sees a parent bullying a child with contempt, or when he sees a parent heartlessly ignoring a suffering child. Okay. I love this book. Okay, optimal stress is the next one, and we'll finish off with this one for this time. The quest to ongoingly grow and evolve out of my childhood trauma sometimes becomes more embraceable to me when I remember the poet's words. Quote, "He not busy being born is busy dying." In fact, some of these latest research in neuroscience suggests that we actually need a modicum or a small amount of stress in our life. This type of stress is called optimal stress. Optimal stress is the balanced, moderate amount of stress that appears to be necessary to grow the new neurons and neuronal connections that correlate with keeping the brain healthy. In other words, the parts of your brain that didn't work before, I know that sucks and it's hard, but the good thing is that your brain will create new pathways. So keep persevering. Research shows that just as too much stress creates a biochemical condition that damages neurons in the brain, too little stress leads to atrophy, which is the loss of muscle, death, and lack of replacement of all old neurons. This is why lifelong learning is widely recognized as one of the key practices necessary to avoid Alzheimer's disease, in my opinion. So just read a book. Just always be reading something. You will not get Alzheimer's, or at least that's the hope. In my opinion, lifelong recovery is an exalted subset of lifelong learning. That makes sense. I believe that optimal stress is frequently attained when we practice the behaviors that remedy our developmental arrests. Examples of this include reading self-help books, attending self-improvement workshops, working at deeper self-discovery through journaling, or struggling to be more vulnerable and authentic in a therapy session or an evolving relationship. Moreover, it might be that minor flashbacks sometimes function as optimal stress. I certainly know a number of long-term recoveries who seem to be evolving and becoming sharper in their old age. Oh, thank God. We'll do one more. Silver linings. We live in an emotionally impoverished culture, and those who stick with a long-term recovery process are often rewarded with emotional intelligence far beyond the norm. Thank God. This is somewhat paradoxical, as survivors of childhood trauma are initially injured more grievously in their emotional natures than those in the general population. The silver lining in this, however, is that many of us were forced to consciously address our suffering because our wounding was so much more severe. Those who work an effective recovery program not only recover significantly from emotional damage, but also evolve out of the emotional impoverishment of the general society. One of my clients described this as becoming, quote, way more emotionally intelligent than the normies. Perhaps the greatest reward of improved emotional intelligence is seen in a greater capacity for deeper intimacy. Emotional intelligence is a foundational ingredient of relational intelligence, a type of intelligence that is also frequently diminished in the general populace. As stated earlier, intimacy is greatly enhanced when two people dialogue about all aspects of their experience. This is especially true when they transcend taboos against full emotional communication. Feelings of love, appreciation, and gratitude are naturally enhanced when we reciprocally show our full selves, confident or afraid, loving or alienated, proud or embarrassed. What an incredible achievement it is when any two of us create such an authentic and supportive relationship. Many of the most intimate relationships that I have seen are between people who have done a great deal of freeing themselves from the negative legacies of their upbringing. Okay. We'll continue next time with chapter 4 here with the subtitle, The Unexamined Life is Not Worth Living. We'll pick up there. All right, guys. Much love and see you next time.